everybody, I'm Kat Craig. I come from Wisconsin, and I am a UI UX designer in both the games and tech industries. I've been doing this for about 16 years. I've had the fortune to work on games such as Baldur's Gate 3, Luigi's Mansion, Dark Moon, like some indie titles that I'm working on, and that's kind of where I'm at today, and I'm excited to be here.
What led you to this path? What was your introduction into, I guess, either the UI space or just the gaming space? What was your introduction into all of that?
Kind of a funny story. So I actually have a degree in music. I thought I was going to be a pop singer, and I still do kind of music on the side when I can. But then I was working just, kind of random office jobs, like being like administrative assistant and things like that. And I wanted more. I wanted more creativity. And so I started freelancing as a print graphic designer. And so I would do things like book covers and book interiors, wedding invitations, things like that. And so with that foundation, I started doing more digital kind of work, and that started off in web design. So UI UX wasn't really like a thing when I first started doing it. It was just called like web design. So I started working on websites for Men's Fitness magazine, Shape magazine, and that was like my big break, if you will. So that kind of kickstarted my career, and I started just kind of learning UI UX on the jobs that I've had. And I realized that I've really grown to love really both, like both sides, both creating the UI and the UX, because I like seeing how people think and how they interact with various products.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't have any sort of graphic background or anything like that, but we sort of have the same start because like every graphic you've seen from JamsandJoysticks, I'm the one that made it. And I just had to figure out how to make it and do all these different things. And like I said, I don't have any sort of background. I just, learned on the job as I went, and I've taken different classes and things like that. You talked about how that wasn't necessarily like a thing. Like it wasn't necessarily as it is now, obviously, with technology and stuff, people are learning that. How is that difference? How much of a difference is it to you as far as like, people sort of coming in now as opposed to like when you were starting to learn all of this stuff?
Well, for one, I feel like there's a lot more resources now. So, there are just tons of things that you can learn from, and there are always new techniques coming out, new ways of doing things, different software. I think when I first started, I was still using Photoshop. That's not really the best tool for UI UX. Like now, I use Figma every day. That's like my tool of choice. And it was a lot more painstaking back then, especially when you were handing off whatever you were doing to the developers who were implementing that stuff. You had to do things like red lines, but you had to do them like manually. So you had to like draw a red line and like say the measurement. It was painful. So I feel like things are a lot easier now. But at the same time, because it's so accessible, I feel like you need to make a big effort to stand out, because like there's so many of us and it's so easy to kind of get that knowledge. You really need to kind of step up your game to find other ways to stand out amongst the crowd.
We can sort of dive into more of the tech side of that later, but basically, how does AI and sort of all of those different things sort of factor into the job now, as far as, like you said, having to stand out and do all of these different things? Obviously, AI is not going anywhere and it's only going to continue to progress. How do you sort of look at that change, and how do you use it to benefit, what you're doing now, making it easier for you to do certain things or helping yourself out?
I actually don't use a ton of AI myself, except for maybe, UX writing. I've never been a really strong writer. So I do use ChatGPT to kind of generate and copy for things if I need to. But in terms of coming up with the, visuals, the UI itself, I generally come up with it myself. I do use like various references to come up with ideas and stuff. But in terms of generating the actual artwork, I still do that myself.
Let's dive into games that played growing up and what kind of fostered your creativity and the things that you do now? Like, what were you playing?
I've been playing games since the days of Atari, so I'm aging
Yeah.
myself here, but I've loved games my entire life, really. Like I said, starting with Atari and then getting into Nintendo and then eventually Sega and eventually PlayStation. And now I'm more of a PC player and PlayStation. But a lot of the games that I loved were RPGs, and those are still at the core of my favorites. I think probably my favorite series is Horizon Zero Dawn, Forbidden West. Those are key. I love those games so much. Just from the storytelling alone. I feel like games with really interesting narrative always grab my attention.
Yeah, no doubt. And I mean, we're sort of losing some of those narrative titles these days to the more service games. How does that build into, the games that you've worked on? You can sort of name those again as far as the games you've worked on and stuff like that. Touch on the different elements as far as what you worked on.
Yeah. So I was very excited when Larian reached out to me to kind of add some UX finessing to Baldur's Gate 3. I was already a huge fan of the game. I already put in hundreds of hours. So that was a really amazing project to be able to
a huge game, a very much a beloved sort of follow. People love that game. They love it so much.
It's incredible. And already I didn't feel like there was a ton, but there were things that I wanted to address, like your inventory management. And that's always a big problem in a lot of games. It's just a very hard problem to solve for. So, I kind of came in and I came up with solutions that would organize your inventory a little bit better. So including things like tabs so that you can categorize things so that they're easier to find.
Sorry to cut you off, because somebody has brought this up to me before about inventory being one of the most difficult things to sort of work with, or sort of to come up with. What goes into inventory management, or when you're thinking of how to organize the inventory, what are you thinking about? What is sort of your starting point, and sort of how do you navigate from there? I hear how difficult it is, but people don't necessarily know what that means. So I would love for people to sort of kind of get a deeper dive into that.
Sure. Yeah. I tend to kind of work backwards a little bit. So I think about what your inventory is going to look like at end game points, because that's when you'll have a ton of stuff in your inventory and you're kind of sorting through everything. So I think about the worst case scenario, your inventory is full, how are you going to find something quickly? So that's kind of where I usually start. I'll mock up, your inventory completely full, and what does that look like? And since I had already put a bunch of hours into the game myself, I know what I am already struggling with.
Right.
But then I also kind of talk to other players who play, and they kind of point things out that they wish was already there. And I feel like that's a really important aspect of UX, is talking to other players and getting their feedback. And you might discover things that you haven't even thought of yourself. So just kind of getting that information from them will inform decisions when creating that design. So once I kind of have that mocked up, I start iterating on ideas. So I'll think about, okay, maybe we can have tabs, or maybe there's some kind of filtering system, or, maybe certain parts of the inventory can collapse and open again. So just kind of thinking about how it would be an easier and more digestible experience for players.
And I mean, I guess your average player obviously isn't thinking about those sort of things. They just want to sort of work, you know what I'm saying? That's definitely an interesting way of thinking about it. You also touched on actually playing the game and actually talking to other players. How common is that? Because especially now with sort of how in flux the gaming industry is, and sort of how people are on the move, people are sort of worried about jobs and things like that. But when you're working on something, how often have you already played the game? Do you get to have sort of a baseline before you get to work on something? Is it sort of normal like that? Or is it more somebody reaches out to you and well, I've never played this game, I need to maybe get some background on it? How do you sort of approach that?
Yeah, that definitely does happen, like you mentioned. So I'm actually working with Athena Productions right now, and we're working with a games client, another studio. And
Hmm.
yeah, I haven't played, the previous game. Like, so they're working on the sequel to one of their
Hmm.
games, and I haven't played the first one until I got onto this project. But thankfully, like they gave us keys so we can play it, because it really is important to understand, the mechanics around the game, and like
Right.
that way you can kind of build your experience around those mechanics. So
Mhm.
yeah, oftentimes I will come in really late. And, with the two indie teams that I'm with, the game wasn't even built yet. You're kind of starting, which is kind of an ideal situation, right? You
Yeah, because
want
you
to
sort
start
of
at the very
molding it from the ground up, sort of thing. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah,
Hmm.
exactly.
Yeah.
So it really depends on the project.
So, what is sort of the differences as far as working with of a big company and a big game, sort of like Baldur's Gate, and then versus a indie title that might not have that sort of
Mhm.
budget or that sort of grand scale idea or whatever the case
Mhm.
may be? Like, is one more enjoyable than the other for you? What are the difference, the pros and cons to sort of being in those different type of situations? What is that like for you, sort of being on both sides of that?
Yeah. I'd say with smaller teams, I feel like you can take a little bit more risks.
Mm,
So, you can come up with designs that like maybe hasn't been done before, and it wouldn't be a big deal.
mm,
Whereas I feel like with bigger studios, they already kind of have their set design rules and everything, and you really need to kind of adhere to those.
mm-hmm.
So it can get kind of boring, I guess, at times, because
Yeah.
you can't really experiment too
Mm-hmm.
much. So
Yeah.
I mean, I enjoy both, but I think I like the idea of spreading my wings a little bit and coming up with
Mm-hmm.
new ideas.
What sort of projects, or I guess overall areas, are you working in sort of now? Like, what are you currently working on as far as, whether it be projects or whether it
Mhm.
be a piece of a project? What do you have working now?
Yeah. So for Convergent Studios, which is one of the indie game companies that I'm with, I'm
Hmm.
the lead UI UX designer. So I've been doing things like the heads up display, character select screen. I'm also doing all of the ability icons for our characters. So a lot of different things going on. I also helped build the website for the game. And that's not always the case with everything. That's just what I'm doing with them. And then with Athena, I've been working on more HUD elements where the ammo fits on the screen and everything and
Hmm.
what that looks like, health bars and all of that stuff, coming up with various ideas for that. And then for the other studio that I'm working with, it's a horror game, and it's actually more minimal. So there actually
Okay.
really isn't a lot of UI involved, but I'm also their character concept artist.
Okay.
So I'm
Okay.
kind of doing both.
So, what is the future for like what you do as far as UI and UX and just all of this stuff? I'm sure someone in your position, especially the more you know about this technology, the more you'll be able to do and sort of be able to take on. What
Mhm.
is the next step for you, or is there a next step? Like, are you just comfortable like where you are? Or, would you like to be one of a huge big time CEO,
Oh gosh, no.
UI somewhere, like what is sort of the next step for you as far as your evolution of what you do?
Interestingly enough, I'm kind of moving into like tech art as well. So I've been learning 3D modeling in Blender, and I've also been learning how to create materials and shaders in Unreal Engine and
Mm,
Unity, just because I find it really fun. But
yeah,
also, I think it would really step up my game, because I am looking for like a full-time role. The
yeah,
role that I have with Athena right now is freelance, and it only goes until April as of right now. So still kind of keeping my eyes open.
right.
But I think for me, like just kind of moving up the ladder a little bit, I never really considered myself a manager, but as I've gotten further into my career, I've realized how much I love mentoring others, especially junior designers that are kind of looking to expand their career. It just
Hmm.
brings me a lot of joy to see them succeed and just
Yeah.
kind of help them along their way. So I'd love to kind of be a director in that way. So
Mhm.
just kind of growing into that. In
Yeah.
terms of CEO, though, no.
um, Wisconsin. And so I've interviewed a nice handful amount of people from Wisconsin, and obviously I'm starting to understand that Wisconsin is sort of a gaming hub for you. Has that always been the thing? Talk about just Wisconsin as a whole, as far as gaming and such.
First, let me preface this by saying that I've only been here since 2021. Not terribly long, but since I have been here and kind of like looked into the gaming industry, it's growing a lot. So, we have things like MDev, and I spoke on a panel about UI UX, and everybody was telling me that it's 2 times bigger than it was last year, which is awesome. So I feel like that's just going to kind of continue to grow. But we also have, a department of EA here, PUBG here, and we've got various other studios in Madison. And I know Green Bay is starting to come up. I know Ben Cavallo, he's got Midwest Games going on here.
Yeah, I've interviewed Ben.
Yeah, he's a really cool dude. I feel like it's just growing more and more, and it brings me so much joy because when I first moved here, I was like, oh God, what am I gonna do with my career? But yeah, it's really growing, and it just makes me so happy because I actually just love it here in general. It's quiet, it's affordable, and just really chill place. So coming from big cities like New York City and Seattle and all of that stuff, it's just a really, really nice and welcome change.
What sort of advice do you have for, like you said, you like to mentor people, you like to mentor the juniors and stuff like that. What sort of advice would you give someone that wants to follow in your footsteps, or they want to get into UI or some things like that? Because I know that it's probably easier than ever to sort of get the ball rolling as far as if you want to learn stuff, if you want to watch YouTube videos, courses online, or things like that. What sort of advice would you have for somebody trying to get started within what you're doing?
Absolutely. I would recommend joining some game jams, and you can find a bunch of those really anywhere, but I always refer people to itch.io. They have a bunch of game jams there that you can check out, and that'll give you some really great real world experience in a short span of time. So, you'll understand what it's like to work with other disciplines, and you'll be learning to make a game, and that'll be really important to have on your portfolio. And then you could also volunteer with studios as well. That's what I've been doing, and again, that'll give you some great portfolio work. And then another thing is networking. Like it's just it's so important in this industry to kind of introduce yourself, meet people, putting yourself out there, share with what you're working on. That way you'll kind of like make those connections, and having those referrals for jobs is completely key. And I mentioned this on LinkedIn, but 90% of the interviews that I've gotten over the past year were through referrals. So it just makes a huge, huge difference. And believe it or not, I am somewhat of an introvert. So that makes a huge difference.
To sort of piggyback on that, I'm an introvert, and probably over the last year and a half, all of my interviews have been referrals. So it's basically, like you said, the whole networking and things like that are definitely big parts. I'm getting sort of the impression that a lot of people don't necessarily want to take the risk on someone who doesn't have some sort of background or some sort of something to show that they worked on, or say that you worked on this game or shipped a game or things like that. Speak on the importance of that, because I think when people are trying to get involved and do things, and it's like, well, how do I? Well, like you said, you do have to probably volunteer. So talk about like how difficult it is to actually do certain things without that foundation.
Sure. I mean, without that foundation and without like showing some of the work in your portfolio, unfortunately, recruiters just won't really look at you. They need to see that you kind of understand what it is you're working on. And I do know they're trying to not make it a requirement to ship a game because it's really hard. I mean, sometimes you get laid off in the middle of a production cycle and you don't see it happen. And so I'm starting to see more and more that it's a preference, but it's not necessarily a requirement, which is good. Some studios are still kind of making it a requirement, which is difficult. But yeah, doing those game jams and having those volunteer experiences where you can, show the stuff that you've done, it really, really does make a huge difference. I feel like once I started adding that stuff to my own portfolio, I was getting more interviews that way as well. It's just because I show that I have that experience. And also I would say start learning how to implement your design into game engines as well. for a while there, you could kind of get away with not doing that. But especially with the market the way it is, competition is so fierce. You really, really need to know how to implement your UI into Unreal or Unity or whatever. I would say don't try to learn all the engines because that would be a little bit overkill, but at least try to touch on both Unity and Unreal because those are the two that are, you know, the most used right now. And they're free. So, you know, you could just kind of dive in, but do learn it, do kind of strengthen those skills because it's just going to be so important.
Let people know how they can reach out to you, how people can reach you on socials and different things like that.
I'm Kat Craig on LinkedIn. That's probably the platform that I use the most. I'm also on BlueSky under the same name. And I have my artwork on Instagram as well under the same name. So feel free to check me out there.